What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, and on this episode, we're going to break down Will Manny by the numbers. After this past weekend, I went back, looked at some of his stats through the first 7 games this season. Some things really stood out to me there, so we're going to go over that here in this episode. Like I said, Will Manny by the numbers. Then a little bit later on, we'll round out the show. I'll put a bow on my final thoughts on this Cannons organization within the PLL and really what they need to do moving forward to improve their team for the long term. But to start out the show, what a loaded weekend this past week in pro lacrosse. We had 10 games in total between the PLL and Athletes Unlimited. Some storylines in case you missed any of the action this weekend. I was actually able to watch all 10 games, all 40 quarters of action, and I took it all in, and I regret absolutely none of it. But if you missed anything from this past weekend in pro lacrosse, a couple storylines that I was able to take from both the PLL and Athletes Unlimited. The Atlas clinched a playoff spot. They're now the second team, along with the Whip Snakes, to secure a spot in the playoffs with their win over the Archers this weekend down in Texas. Nakai Montgomery, speaking of Texas, scored multiple goals in his home state this weekend after only having 1 goal entering that game this weekend. The Chrome dropped their 3rd straight game in a row, now sitting 4th in the standings. The Atlas, because of their win against the Archers, on the flip side, jumped from 4th up to 2nd behind the Whip Snakes in the standings, and we always talk about those top 4 being part of that championship series in early 2023, so both those teams, along with the Whip Snakes and Archers, are still part of that top 4 unit. The Cannons lose again, but again, I'll get to more on them later in this episode. Then looking at Athletes Unlimited, a really great weekend of Athletes Unlimited lacrosse. It was so much fun to take in those games, so electric, as Team Apuzzo doesn't really know what losing is. I believe they went 3-0 here on this past weekend. They also won the first shootout in Athletes Unlimited lacrosse history on Saturday in a come-from-behind win there. Charlotte North, one of the rookies in Athletes Unlimited this season, credited with the first ever Athletes Unlimited lacrosse shootout goal as she led things off there for Team Apuzzo in the shootout. Lauren Gilbert, another fantastic rookie out of Northwestern that I really have started to like how she plays offensively, just plays the game at such a fast speed and really forces defenders on their heels whenever she has the ball in her cross. So just a really exciting player, one of the many exciting rookies in this Athletes Unlimited rookie class. Some red cards were also issued this weekend. One came very late in the 4th quarter in the game with Team Apuzzo during that comeback. That was one of the things that sort of helped spark their comeback late as well. So some key issue there. And then another one was issued on Sunday, I believe, as well. Some injuries as well, some key injuries from this past weekend that were notable, where Jamie Ortega left Saturday's game with an injury. I forget what her injury specifically was, but left a game on Saturday. And then Kayla Wood left Sunday's game with an apparent hamstring injury, which was really unfortunate to watch as she was on a clear breakaway down the field. Nobody really in front of her. There was really no contact on the play, but just as she was coming down the field, if you didn't see the play, was just coming downfield in transition off a ground ball and just immediately went straight to the ground, holding her leg. So that was very unfortunate to see for her. Hope that both those players are okay in the long term. But to get to this episode, like I said, here in segment 1, Will Manny by the numbers, it's really something that stood out to me as he really had another ineffective game this past weekend against the Atlas, and that's his 2nd such game against the Atlas this year. So it really got me thinking, and I had to go back and look, and what I found was actually pretty eye-opening, I guess you could say, is that he leads the Archers in points, and he's now 2nd in the PLL behind only Lyle Thompson with 29 points. He's a very balanced contributor with 15 goals and 14 assists on the year, but his breakdown of these numbers is what really kind of stood out to me. Of those 29 points, 22 of them are against teams with a losing record in 4 such games. He has 7 then against winning teams in 3 games, 2 of which coming against the Atlas. Against losing teams, he averages 5.5 points per game on 3 goals a game and 2.5 assists per game, while shooting 43% and 9 combined turnovers. Against winning teams, on the other hand, he averages just 2.3 points on 1 goal and 1.3 assists a game, while shooting only 14%, including 0 for 7 in 2 games against the Atlas this season. So again, you can see that difference between games against winning teams and games against losing teams. And I think that this sparks an interesting discussion around his MVP chances, because that's something that when I had Phil Rothermick on a few weeks ago, that was somebody that he kind of talked me into including on my MVP discussion list, along with guys like Trevor Baptiste that I've mentioned before. And I've seen his name in places like the PLL Discord. I've seen Will Manny's name thrown around there a bit as part of that MVP discussion. But like I said, I think that this sparks an interesting discussion around that, because you could ask, are his numbers in bad games and the Archers' struggles offensively in those same games helping his case for MVP or hurting them? Because when you look at not just his performance in some of those losing efforts, but the Archers offense as a whole in those games, they average 9.67 goals a game in losses, and they average 16 scores a game in the wins, as they're 4-3. They're 4-0 against teams with a losing record. They're 0-3 against teams with a winning record this season. So I think you can make the argument that it actually helps his case for MVP, because the offense goes sort of as he goes, right? Like when he has a good game, the offense has a good game. And I think those scores against averages against winning and losing teams kind of bears that out, is that they go kind of, like I said, they go as he go. But I think my overall take on this, to kind of put a bow on the Will Manny discussion here on this show, is that I think it hurts his case, because the MVP should be someone that puts consistent numbers up each and every game. And I know that that's easier said than done no matter what sport you talk about, whether it's lacrosse, football, basketball, baseball, whatever it is. It's easier said than done to put up consistent high numbers like he does against the winning teams, averaging 5.5 points in each of those games. But when you look around the league, we see other guys, not even just in other positions, but at his position as well, doing just that. You see a guy like Trevor Baptiste at the faceoff comes back from an injury and goes 64% this weekend against the Archers, and hasn't gone below 63% in a single game yet this season. So he's doing it at a consistent level. You want to talk about a guy at his own position in Lyle Thompson, who now has one more point to lead the league over Will Manny at his own position. He's averaging 5.5 points per game this season as a whole, and he's doing it in one less game than Will Manny's had. So my final take on it is that not only, do I think that Will Manny won't win MVP this year, I don't even think he'll win Attackman of the Year, because like I said, you look at a guy like Lyle Thompson at his same position, has more points than him this year, and he's done it in that one less game. And you even look at a guy like Jeff Teat, has a higher shooting percentage than Will Manny with a couple less shots on goal to his credit. So like I said, my final take is, and it might be a hot take, I'll admit, but my final take is, not only do I think that Will Manny won't win MVP, I don't even think he'll necessarily win Attackman of the Year, because you could make the case for Lyle Thompson, you could make the case for Jeff Teat, you could even make the case for Brendan Nichtern, who's right up there in points this year as a rookie at attack. So coming up in segment 2, like I said, I'll kind of put a bow on this Cannons team in the PLL and the start that they've had, the lackluster start that they've had to their PLL tenure here as a Cannons lacrosse club. But that's coming up in segment 2. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Second and final segment of the show here, recapping everything in pro lacrosse from this past weekend. We talked top of the show about Athletes Unlimited a little bit. recapped the weekend of games for you there, as well as giving some storylines from the PLL action this weekend, including Nakai Montgomery scoring a couple goals in his home state for the Redwoods, albeit in a losing effort to the Chaos, but another big one, the Atlas clinching a playoff spot, now just the second PLL club along with the Whipsnakes to do so here this season. But again, I want to put a bow on this Cannons topic and really what they need to do moving forward to sort of right the ship with this team going forward into the future, because I think the Cannons need to start a rebuild. And I know everyone says that they still have a shot to make the playoffs. Virtually everybody still has somewhat of a chance of making the playoffs because 7 of the 8 clubs make it. So you could still win 2-3 games on the year and make it in as that 7 seed. But I think that even if they make it, it'll be similar to what we saw with them last year. They kind of backdoored their way in because the Chrome were not very good. They were dealing with all those various injuries. So they basically had to win that game at the end of the season. I believe that was the game against the Chrome that they had to win at the end of the regular season to even get in to the postseason. And then they were out in the first round, losing to the Atlas. And I think that even if they were to make it this year, they'd probably make it as the 7th seed. They'd probably end up playing a team like the Atlas or the Whipsnakes or whoever, and they'd be out in the first round. So really at that point, it's almost like, what's the point of making it when you don't even have a first round pick coming in 2023? So like I said, I don't see a ton of value in them sort of quote unquote going for it and trying to make the playoffs when I think just about everybody can agree they're probably not going to do a whole lot once they get there. And like I said, they don't have that first round pick next year. They traded up this past spring in the draft for Bubba Fairman in 2022 with the Atlas. So the Atlas get their first round pick again next year. Something that Ben Rubior has been known to do is to fleece, if you will, the Cannons out of their first round picks. So he did again for next season. And I think now sitting at 1-6 on the year, the Cannons are, I think you start trading just about anyone you can. If I'm in the position that Sean Quirk is in as sort of the coach / GM, I'd start trading just about anybody I can, not named Morocco, Thompson, or Nolting, for picks and maybe some expiring contracts at the end of 2022 or 2023, or just trade for picks and then take what you can get from the player pool. Either way, I think works. But really, you have to just admit to this point that Quirk has been aggressive in assembling this roster through trades and things like that. Obviously, we've seen with the trade moving up to get Fairman. We've seen in the past trading for guys like Paul Rabel, giving up the first round picks that he did there. He's been very aggressive in trading to acquire pieces for this roster, and it just hasn't worked, as they're now 4-12 since joining the PLL. So obviously, like I said, just hasn't gone the way that he would have hoped in being ultra aggressive in the way that he's put together this roster. And I think that when you look at the Cannons' young core, you talk about guys like Nolting, Bubba Fairman, who I said they traded up to get, guys like that, their young core to me just doesn't measure up to the rest of the league. You talk about a team like the Atlas loaded with young talent, guys like Teat, Gray, Kobe Smith, Danny Logan. I think you could even put a guy like Brian Costabile in that mix in terms of young core, because he's only about 24 years old midway through the season. So again, just so many different guys on this roster that are consistent contributors that are part of that young core. You look at a team like the Archers, you've got Jared Connors, you've got D. Simone, you've got Matt Moore, etc. The Chrome, you've got Wisnauskas, Nick Turn, Morrill, JT Giles Harris, the list goes on. The Water Dogs, you've got Sowers, Jack Hanna, Ethan Walker. Again, the list goes on. The Cannons, you look at the Cannons, and like I said, you've got Nolting. He's probably your biggest positive in terms of guys that you've drafted since joining the PLL and also being part of that young core. But after him, what do you really have? I mean, you've got Fairman, who has 4 points in 6 games. I guess that's not terrible per se, but they also don't, I think, really know what he is or where he is being utilized, as far as, is he a two-way mid? Is he a D mid who can can run the transition at times. Like, what really is he right now? I think that's something that they're trying to figure out, is what is he and where does he fit on this team. And then you've got a guy like Steven Rafis, who I believe is in his second year in the PLL. So kind of similar to what I said about Costabile is, he's not a rookie, but he's also not that old yet either. He's probably only in his early to mid 20s at this point in his career, and he's only got 3 goals on 15% shooting. So again, when you measure the Cannons' young core against the rest of the league, and especially the teams that I laid out just a moment ago, their young core just, to me, doesn't really measure up to the rest of the league. And I think that's where you start to have that conversation of trading guys for picks and loading up on draft capital, which is something that a guy like Ben Rubior has done the past couple of years. And you just try to get younger, more athletic, and find guys that you can actually plug and play at certain positions, because that's another thing that the Cannons have struggled with, is putting guys seemingly in positions that they haven't played before, where you look at guys like Ryan Drenner, who is more of an attackman by trade, but he's been playing midfield for the Cannons. I think Rafis as well, coming out of college, was more of an attackman by trade, but they moved him to midfield. And if I'm not mistaken, even to start the year in weeks 1 and 2, possibly, if I remember correctly, they even had Asher Nolting coming from the midfield rather than playing attack, and then they made that switch not that far into the season. But again, just the pieces maybe not fitting where they need to be fitting at, kind of some uncertainty of where certain guys fit on this roster. And then again, just the young core not matching that of the rest of the league. So my final take on this topic, sort of to put a bow on it, I'll try to stay away from this topic for the rest of the season, but I think they need help, and they need it fast. I mean, many of the teams I listed before built through the draft, most notably the Atlas with Ben Rubior and what he's done with this roster. And I think that it's time that the Cannons got on board with that, because you look at statistically where they measure compared to the rest of the league. They're 5th in scoring offense. They're last in scoring defense. They're the first team to give up 100 scores or more this season. The next closest was 92 scores. They're 5th in faceoff percentage, and this is where I have to give them some credit for this season. This is the one place where I think I can actually give Sean Quirk credit for improving this roster from a year ago, as even though they're only 5th in faceoff percentage this year, that's still a 10% increase from where they were a year ago. So I have to give them some credit there, but they're also last in power play and 6th in penalty kill, while being the 2nd most penalized team in the PLL, while also leading the league in turnovers. So again, outside of, I guess you could say, face-off percentage, there's not a ton that this team really does well, and that's a big problem for them moving forward. So I think that it's time that the Cannons sort of admit defeat and just blow it up and try to get as much as they can out of the draft next spring. And it's not going to be just a one draft thing. This is going to be kind of similar to what you saw with the Atlas. It took them 2 drafts essentially to get to where they are now. So I think that if they start the process now and start the process for 2023, then they'll be much better off in the long run. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. Also, find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Stitcher, just to name a few. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.